So just as a, what's that, Patrick?
30 seconds.
So you have time, Lenore. So Hope is,
Okay.
just as a reminder, Hope staffs policy committee from a legal perspective.
We are live on Facebook.
Mhm.
We're live on YouTube.
So you have time, Lenore. So Hope is, just as a reminder, Hope staffs policy committee from a legal perspective.
We are live on Facebook.
Whoever that is talking is a genius right there. I know that much. All right, so we are everywhere we need to be.
Lenora, let's get us started.
Okay. I now call the electronic May 18th, 2021 Policy Committee of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education to order. I am Lenore Shipp, Chair of the Policy Committee. We have a quorum present, so let's start the introductions of the committee. I'll start with Dr. Jones.
I am Ruby Jones. I represent Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools and District 3.
Okay. Ms. Sawyer.
I am Carol Sawyer. I represent District 4 on the Board of Education.
And Mr. Strain.
Sean Strain and I represent District 6.
And we have other board members present with us today. If they would introduce themselves, our chairperson.
There, everybody. I'm Lee Stashew, represent at large, and I chair the board.
And I see is Ms. Stella Parr.
Yes, hello everyone. Jennifer De La Hara at large. I have my camera turned off today, but I'll be listening.
All right. Thank you all. Today, we have one agenda item. Today, the review of policy GCOA, teacher contracts. And I turn to Policy Administrator Charles Jeter for this.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I won't belabor the point, but this is policy GCOA, which has gone through this committee once, was discussed at our previous meeting, has gone to the full board and back to us. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, we will finish the policy committee's work on the proposed changes to policy GCOA teacher contracts. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our Chief Human Resources Officer, Ms. Pajot, and her team to lead y'all through the discussion. Y'all should have all the documents that I emailed to you. If you don't, if you will either text or put it in the chat, I will let you know. For those of y'all watching at home or in your office, I will make sure all the documents are posted on board docs so everyone can find them.
Thank you, Mr. Jeter. I'd like to take a moment. This is Christine Pajot, Chief Human Resources Officer. I'd like to take a brief moment to allow my team who is with me here today to introduce themselves. Makisha, would you like to start?
Good morning, Makisha Mills, Executive Director of Human Capital Management Team.
Good morning, Chris Organ, Executive Director of HRIS.
Good morning, Cheryl Munn, Director of Performance Management.
Thank you. This team were some of the people who were instrumental in preparing the responses that we shared with some of the policy committee members over the course of last week relative to policy GCOA. So we would really like to welcome any questions that the policy committee members may have about the data that was shared in response to those questions. And we are also happy to discuss really anything related to the policy changes. I believe that during our last meeting on this, HR advocated for why we had proposed changes to the policy to allow the issuance of 4-year contract renewals in cases where teachers were able to meet the proficient standard on their teacher evaluation. That prompted, of course, much discussion and many requests for either information or data that we have subsequently provided. So with that, I'd love to turn it back over to the policy committee chair so that we can address any questions that the board has.
I'm going to look to the committee. Are there any questions right now at this time?
Okay, just for an update for everyone listening, we are still referring to the 700 and was it 762? 61
761
teachers. And I had asked some prior questions regarding the nature of deficiencies. Was it around not passing the state mandated testing? In general, what seemed to be the reason for such a large number that we were looking at?
Yeah, so we did try to dig deeper, and in doing so, we identified some issues around the evaluation instrument itself, which of course is something that is not controlled by CMS. It's a state mandated instrument, much of which calls for subjective responses in terms of observers who are observing teachers and rating them in terms of where they stand on certain standards. So that is one thing that we identified as part of the discussion. Ms. Jones, Dr. Jones, you asked specifically on those 761, had they previously passed the praxis? Yes, all of these teachers that would be up for renewal in 2022 have passed the praxis. In fact, that's a licensure requirement for them to be able to satisfy. And then we have additional people. You also asked a question on whether there are others implicated by policy GCOA and what changes, if any, are made to this policy. We do have other employees who are on the instructional pay scale or who are considered instructional support staff. So for example, psychologists, counselors, social workers, and there are approximately, let me look at my data response, 242 additional employees who, if we were to renew tomorrow, based on their most recent evaluation scores, 242 of them would be renewed on a 1-year contract as opposed to a 4-year contract. And that represents about, Chris, you may have to help me out with this, but that's about 50%
So
of those instructional support personnel who are up for renewal.
yeah, it's 54.5%. I think you said 232, but it's actually 132. Yeah.
Okay, excuse me, thank you.
And so we looked at too, where these teachers and support persons may be located in terms of their workspace. Was it elementary, middle school, high school? Was it in the number of, quote, low performing schools designated by the state? Generally, under what conditions are these persons working? And I ask this as a 50-year educator because I made the statement before and I'll make it again. I have had a history of knowing that you can teach quite well at Providence Springs. And you send that same teacher, this has been done, to a school with high poverty, low performing students, and the teachers are not these quote super teachers anymore. In fact, historically, when it did happen, I was around to see how those teachers who had been working hard and dedicated, and the super teachers were sent over to their schools. Those same hardworking teachers had to help assist those teachers who worked in more schools where students come ready, prepared, and supported. So I don't want, in this time when it is difficult, absolutely almost impossible, as I'm reaching out to talk to college students about going into education, and there's a dearth of college students wanting to do so, that we are on a penalty level instead of a supportive upgrading those persons, and knowing that we've had some formalized process to do so. I know that I'm making a comment, but it is something that plays into declaring someone deficient and under what circumstances that's done. This is 50 years in education. This is something I feel strongly about. Part of my latter experience was to work in schools around this state with low-performing students. Low-performing students, or low-performing schools rather, because of their designation. So this is impactful, not on just the spirit of these professionals, but the objectivity of what they have to do. So will you comment?
Yes, absolutely. And in response to your questions, there's a few things, or in response to your comments. We're certainly not saying that these teachers, these 761 teachers, are deficient. In fact, by definition, they are proficient. And we want to do whatever it takes to retain proficient and rock star, let's just say it, right? Proficient and above average teachers for our students in CMS, because the proficient teachers are the ones who we believe we can invest in and we can support and we can grow. Now, to your point regarding where these teachers are located and how culture, climate, and challenges, depending upon the school and the region, present themselves, that is very true. And at the end of the day, what we're really trying to get at is effectiveness for students and student achievement, and making sure that we can move the needle on students. However, when we look at the current instrument that's being used, and knowing that we're using that to tie that to a teacher's job security, a teacher who we've all agreed is proficient at the very least, it's problematic when we reference the schools of education that you referred to that are having declining enrollments, less and less people going into education. And the superintendent has charged me and my team to do whatever we can to retain good teachers. It seems counterintuitive then that we would have hundreds of teachers just next year that if we were going to renew them tomorrow, would have to be reduced from a 4-year to a 1-year contract based on current policy. Now, Mr. Strain, for example, asked many questions to get to that connection of student achievement related to how teachers are observed and evaluated. And what I think is the most troubling, and where we do have work to do, not just human resources and not just CMS, but really across the state, is that, we took our data and we looked at how teachers were evaluated and we compared that to actual student achievement. So we were able to identify a school, for example, where students, all of the teachers at that particular school were rated fairly high, yet student growth was pretty flat. And then we've seen other schools where student growth was significant, yet the teacher evaluation scores were average. So it really does call into question the efficacy of that instrument. And then if we're going to tie that to a teacher's job security, that's what we're saying is problematic. We had a lot of discussion during our last session, good, healthy discussion about the why and unveiling and digging deeper. And those are all important. I think everything that each committee member brought forth was incredibly important and significant, and that this is about closing achievement gaps. This is about lifting all students up to where they need to be in terms of performance. Yet we can't ignore, and I can tell you that no one on our team takes a head in the sand approach to any of this. And we are exposing gaps and problems with a system-wide way that we evaluate teachers. We have hundreds upon hundreds of evaluators in this district. Some of them are experienced. Some of them are inexperienced, and that's not a bad thing to say that they're inexperienced. They're just early administrators compared to those who have more experience. People bring their own biases unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, although I don't think that we see much of that. It's more of people's experiences and how they evaluate someone. I like to sometimes take it out of the context of education altogether. We all watch American Idol, right? We've seen that. We've seen there's a panel of 3 judges, and it's very easy to spot a rock star. Everyone agrees, everyone's in consensus. Just like it's fairly easy to spot a low performer. So I don't think we have any questions about who our rock star teachers are and who our low performers are. However, we have a lot of people in the middle, a lot of good people who bring talent and who make an impact with students in our district. And for whatever reason, they have not achieved the majority of accomplished on this evaluation instrument. And because of that, this district would need to be prepared to put them down to 1-year contracts if there is not a policy change here. And that is something that the board does need to weigh with and struggle. And we do have work that we need to do. And I can say in my relatively short tenure at CMS, we've put our best foot forward to get to where we need to be in many areas. And with the pandemic overshadowing all of that, probably I can say, a good 15 months out of perhaps the 20 months, I think, since I've been in office here at CMS. There has been a lot of good work done in this vein, but it's a collaborative work. It needs to be done with professional development. It needs to be done with our principals. It needs to be done with our teachers. It needs to be, there's advocacy at the state level. It's a multifaceted issue that I hope I'm exposing is not something that is easily fixed. Yet our teachers are going to be facing this fate in less than a year.
Bravo. I agree 110% with every statement that came from your what you've just spoken. Thank you.
I would like to say, and Mr. Strain, did you have something?
Go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay. I would like to say, as someone who's been the teacher in CMS, someone who's been an administrator in CMS and truly understands is everything you're saying, Christine. I think what's, Ms. Joe, what I think is so important is we cannot, this is stuck in my head, change student outcomes until we strongly look at adult behavior changes and what adults must do to impact student achievement at high levels. And at a time where we have so much unfinished learning, our students have really struggled during this pandemic. And we know it's been difficult for administrators to evaluate teachers in this pandemic. That's what you're saying, and I know it. I've spoke to administrators, I've spoke to teachers. It's been difficult, and this is a state requirement, as you just said. However, I know the job of the administration, the teacher, and the learning community soup, they must come together as a team and work on this process, this issue of how do we retain and ensure that we have highly effective teachers in this district. That is a job. And that is the job the administrators are charged with. The learning community soups must help monitor, and the teachers have a part in as well. Right now, teachers know that are coming up for this year, the teacher contract, they already know what expectations are. I've heard teachers say this, and they were concerned about where we were on this because they already knew that they had to have, as it stands, 3 out of 5 majority accomplished. This is the work. It is difficult work. It is hard work. There are problems with biases, integrated reliability, but this is our job, I think, as a board to look at this, as administrators in the schools, learning community soups, to do this work, to ensure all of our children are going to get the best possible education. And we're going to move the needle with children. This is about our children. We must fight for the best educators for our children. I've been that strategic principal, as Dr. Jones mentioned, in a school where it was difficult. I had new staff, And the job of the administrator in all of these schools is to grow and support, give them tools, give them PD, look at their plans if necessary to ensure that they do get where they need to be. We're not talking about first year teachers level that are first year, second year, third year, who should be proficient at the end of their third year. We're looking at teachers that's 7 years in, 8 years in. We want to believe that these teachers have moved beyond proficient to accomplish. That's where the rigor is for children. That's where the real teaching is strong. Differentiation, really understanding content, really facilitating instruction at the levels where we will move these students. Yes, we have effective teachers, but we got to move these students as 2 years behind, 3 years behind. Students that have lost, as they say, open these gaps right now. So we're talking about this pandemic, which it has been difficult to evaluate teachers in a pandemic. It has been difficult maybe to monitor the process, but going forward, how do we ensure, behaviors will meet student outcomes? And I know we have to look at accomplished. I just really believe, yes, we want them to be all proficient, and that's good. But is that good enough for the numbers of children we still got to continue to move, especially, and let's look at those 42 schools that are struggling. We know we want to have the best teachers, so maybe we want to retain them, but we want to retain them and give them the support and tools they need to be their best. And that's where the work is. I asked you about data for those who were at least had one accomplished and two accomplished. When I looked at this, we had over half of those 761 teachers that were pushing towards accomplished, because that's where we want them to be. That's where they want to be. I believe teachers do want to see this growth as well. And I think, yes, we have work to do, but to say a 7 or 8 year experienced teacher, we are all proficient and that's good enough. Is it really good enough? And I've been in the schools. I've seen the need for growth and development for our children. And I know the difference with the effective teacher, the highly effective teacher. So I want that effective teacher to become highly effective. And that's the job. And I just feel like we can do this. Yes, there's work to be done. And I think the plan is, how do we do it? Not saying, okay, all proficient, when they're proficient at the end of 3 years to receive licensure. So where's the growth? Where's the work that they're going to do to ensure all children are going to move to their highest potential? I just have a hard problem with saying this is good enough. This is where we are as a district. And I understand the pandemic, because I think that's what we're really fighting here, 2020, 2021. But can we say going forward, this type of evaluation system and leave it saying all proficient is good enough for what we need for our children?
I don't know. Substantively,
Go ahead.
As I
Go
will
ahead.
remind y'all, if I could, all conversations go through the chair. I know in a
Yes.
Zoom meeting it's harder, so I would ask Ms. Ship, if you have it, once again, if you'll go through Ms. Ship and she'll
Yeah.
recognize you, so
I'm on.
everybody can make sure they're heard.
Okay, I'm raising my hand.
Did
Can
Ms.
you see
Pajo,
that?
was Ms. Pajo responding to my statement or question?
Yes.
I'll defer. I'm here at your pleasure, so I will defer back to the chair.
I would like to hear that response first, and then I have something to say. Okay. Ms. Pajo.
Ms. Chip,
Yes.
is it fine for me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so no, we are not suggesting that HR somehow just wants teachers who are just barely good enough. That's not what we're saying. What we are trying to call to the policy committee's attention is the reality that while it sounds good in theory, that if we have an evaluation system, we would certainly want people to demonstrate growth and be able to award them because of that. However, we've identified some problems with the system in terms of how teachers are evaluated that don't necessarily correlate to that student achievement that we are all so diligently seeking and trying to move the needle on. Also, we know that we have a recruitment and retention issue that's nationwide that CMS does not face alone. So what we have to be willing to say is if we don't change the policy here, we are telling hundreds of teachers that, no, proficient isn't good enough. We don't want to extend you with us for 4 years. We're going to extend you 1 year, and you need to get to accomplished. That, from a teacher and how it's going to land on them, teachers have options.
Yeah.
Teachers can go anywhere who are licensed and get a 1-year commitment.
Okay.
So I would love us to be able to embrace a philosophy where we're saying, we recognize that you've moved the needle with students because proficient means that you are doing your job well and you've met standards and you are making an impact in the classroom. We want to continue to grow you, and that is a multi-year effort. And we want to continue to make that happen. And the onus is on us as a district and on leadership and on support services departments to be able to help you get there. And then we need to work as a system to be able to get us to where we need to be to that end so that we can demonstrate that commitment to teachers and our value to them in ways that we can meaningfully give back to them, because we don't have ways that we can incentivize them financially. So really what we've said is our only way to do this is to give you a longer contract tenure. I mean, there are always ways that we can still dismiss teachers who are low performing, and none of these 761 teachers have been designated as teachers who are low performing.
Right.
That would be a very different story.
Right.
We would never support a position to retain low performing teachers for multiple years. These are proficient teachers that we want to say, look, we've identified issues with our system. We've identified opportunities where we can perhaps better tie the standards of our evaluation directly to our PD so that we can help support you to that end and get to accomplished. But if we haven't done that fully as a system with fidelity, then I don't think it's the equitable thing to do to hold teachers solely accountable for that and take them off of a multi-year contract and reduce them to a 1-year contract.
Well, I asked the question also about other options, other things we could look at, and I don't think you answered that one. We talked about it in the last meeting about could we look at some of the other ways for those teachers who didn't get 3 out of 5. We talked about other options, some people call it a portfolio, other ways. So that kind of balances out those who have made it, those that don't. How can we look at other options for those teachers as opposed to bringing that bar back to proficient when it's not at proficient right now? We're talking about bringing it down to proficient. We're talking about moving the bar down because that's not where it is in this particular policy right now. So when I asked about these other options, are we looking at other ways to meet the needs of those teachers who are not there? Because you have teachers that are there. And then for these teachers who are not, and we looked at a whole list of things we could consider. And I'm trying to figure out where's that? We've talked about a 2-year. Where's that in this policy? Where's the possibility of that?
If you're referring to the questions, Ms. Shipp, that you submitted following the policy committee last go around, you asked specific questions related to how many of those teachers have 2 or more accomplished ratings. And for example, the response to that was 75 out of the 761.
I was asking a question. I also asked the question about what are some other options, such as if they were national board certified, if they had leadership in their schools, if they had licensures in other area. What about if we looked at standards 3 or 4 out of those accomplished being looked at? I gave you that list along with the questions about accomplished rating.
Yes, and that's what I was getting to. So in those responses back to you, presumably you're asking how many people have 2 or more or 1 or more, so we can understand how many more that would capture. You also asked about national board certified. of those 761, 31 of those candidates are national board certified. So that's to the extent to which it would change if we looked at national board certification. You asked about licensure. May I respond to the licensure component?
No, you didn't respond to that one. And then there was also leadership, and there were about 6 of those. And then I asked about how many teachers had accomplished in areas 3 or 4.
Lenora, she asked, could she respond to it?
Yes, but go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you said
that's
you
okay. So for the licensure, we did take a look at teachers who are licensed in multiple areas. The reason why that's problematic and not necessarily connected to student achievement, which is what we're trying to get at, is many teachers are licensed in areas that they don't teach. So that's not really going to move the needle in terms of them using their skills and subject area expertise in areas for which they're not teaching students. Also, licensure, somebody could be licensed in one area and have to meet certain requirements in order to maintain that don't necessarily correlate with a 4-year cycle for contract renewal. So you can be licensed in a certain area for just a certain period of time, get preliminary licensure, and then not meet continuing education, and then the licensure goes away, yet we've renewed that person on a multi-year contract. So again, not something that really directly would move the needle on student effectiveness if that's the outcome that we're trying to look for. And when we looked at national board certified, there was such a relatively low number of teachers in that group who are nationally board certified, and not a lot of studies to direct the correlation there either. So we could add that as a multiple measure. I think some of these questions are born out of the fact that there are some counties in North Carolina that have a multiple measure test like that. But in effect, what they're doing is they're just creating more ways in which they can increase the number of teachers who are renewed on a multi-year contract. So if that's really the end goal, that's why HR proposed having a proficient standard and really decoupling the issue. I think that Ms. Sawyer referred to it as decoupling, not necessarily tying somebody's job security with their contract renewal to what they've scored on their evaluation, so long as they are meeting standards. We don't want people who are not meeting standards. That would be silly. That wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. But I really respectfully like to push back on the notion that we are trying to somehow lower teaching standards, because there's nothing in the state of North Carolina that says you need to look at the teacher's evaluation in issuing a contract renewal. That's something that this board has done over the course of the last several years. I believe it was around 2018, because again, in theory, I can understand why there would be proponents to advocate for that. It makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, it's based on an instrument that is broken.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And that's why we're trying to get a balance here of what really looks at high performance for student achievement. What really looks at that? I think that's the question. And how do we achieve that? And I'm going to go ahead and ask Mr. Strain, go ahead with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure I do agree that the instrument's broken. The instrument's used across the state. And of course, there's a process when we talk about inter-rater reliability. So you're correct. This expectation was set by a board policy in 2018. When were these contracts let? The 4-year contracts we're talking about, that staff will be coming to the end of their 4-year contracts and will be up. When were those contracts signed?
Approximately 3 years ago. It would have been the same school year, 2018. Is that correct, Chris? Right. They're coming up for renewal in 2022.
Right. So in April of 18, this board defined an expectation that at the end of 4 years, they would be accomplished in 3 of the 5. And so every contract that was signed with the understanding that this expectation was there. Now we're 3 years into it, and we're saying, well, we're thinking about changing the rules. The expectation is there because accomplished teachers, we believe that accomplished teachers do better for students than proficient teachers. That's why it's there, right? And so we found some cases where the data doesn't support that the growth is aligned with the evaluations. That raises the question, what are we doing about that? So there are 761 teachers that after 3 years were not in a position, and they've known the expectation all along. And after 3 years, they're not in the position, if they continue on the course with the evaluations that they're getting, to get a 4-year contract. So what is the plan for those 761 teachers? What are we doing with those 761 teachers? What are we doing with the administrators of the 761 teachers to support them and empower those same teachers to accomplish the objectives that we set 3 years ago, which was that they become highly effective teachers, accomplished in at least three of the five areas, so that they can be awarded with a 4-year follow-on contract. Even today, there's been discussions of penalties. These aren't penalties. They're rewards for accomplishing the objectives that we set 3 years ago, and frankly, that they signed up to 3 years ago. And so I'm struggling a bit with this in terms of understanding how this could possibly be a penalty or punitive. No. The 4-year contract, to your point, is the reward we have, because we don't have a whole lot of other rewards. And the reward is the 4-year contract, which was a deal that we made with these teachers 3 years ago. Now we're 3+ years into it, saying, well, just about 3 years into it, not 3+, just shy of 3 years into it, saying, well, we think maybe we need to relax those expectations. No, we shouldn't relax the expectations. The reason we shouldn't relax the expectations is because they were set 3 years ago. Everybody signed up to them. And we know that when this process and the instrument that's using it is done with integrity, it's best for kids. Because accomplished teachers are better for kids than proficient teachers. And ultimately speaking, that expectation has been set, and there's nothing wrong with that expectation. And so where we find flaws elsewhere in the process, in inter-rater reliability, then we need to be working on those. But it's interesting that 2 years into a 4-year contract, we've taken a look, because they haven't gotten their 3rd-year ratings yet, because that comes now, right, after this year. So 2 years into a 4-year, they had another 2 years to run, and their evaluations are showing that they're not on track. Or perhaps they are. After 4 years, they would actually get to the point where they've got 3 of the 5. But there should be performance plans in place to be able to support and buttress the development of these teachers so that they are accomplished in 3 of the 5. I'm not sure how to get away from those expectations. And the information that's been provided has been very helpful, but it hasn't changed the fact that it's better to have accomplished teachers, and it is a fair expectation to have accomplished teachers after being in the classroom with CMS for 7 years. Madam Chair, that's all I have.
Madam Chair.
Excuse me. Thank you. And I'm going to recognize Kara Sawyer. Kara, Kara hadn't spoken. Do you want to, can I come back to you, Dr. Jones?
Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Okay, Carol is deferring. Ms. Sawyer. Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Oh, no, in fairness to Carol. No, go ahead, Carol, and then I'll say.
I just want to clarify, when teachers signed that 4-year contract, did it say, I mean, and maybe I just misunderstood what Mr. Strain said, but it sounds like they were presented with, in order to get the next 4-year contract, you have to do this. Was that like part of the contract? Is that written into the first 4-year contract?
If you allow me to pull that up, I'd like to take, Chris, you have the response to that?
Yeah, no, it doesn't explicitly refer to the guidelines. There's a link in the contract
It's a policy,
that refers them
guys.
to the policy.
It was an existing policy.
Sean, remember we're going through the chair?
Um,
I asked a question, I got an answer, and I believe I still have the floor.
Yeah. Let's let Chris answer. He was answering your question, Ms. Sawyer.
Yes, ma'am. So the contract they signed is the same as the 1-year contract. It just says a 4-year and then the expiration date, and then it has a link in the contract to the policy.
That's right.
I mean, I understand the desire to be able to declare that we are holding the line on standards, but I think we've heard from staff that the standards of the instrument don't align with student performance, which is our ultimate goal. I mean, if we are about outcomes for students, we've heard from our staff experts that this instrument is not predictive of outcomes for students. And unless I'm misinterpreting, that's what I'm hearing. I also recognize that I'd rather have a 6-year proficient teacher than a long-term sub or no teacher. And that is the reality of what we're facing. So I think Ms. Peugeot characterized my feelings correctly. I think teacher growth doesn't have to be linked to a 4-year contract. I think we can grow our teachers, we can work with our teachers, but I think tying it to the contract is unnecessary. Principals should be growing their teachers all the time. And frankly, I think we should be holding principals accountable, not the teachers. I also recognize that if we tell principals that, you have to have all your teachers on proficient in order to continue your contract, guess what? We're going to have some serious grade inflation. And so I think we're creating a situation where it's going to be harder to get honest and thorough evaluations of teachers, and frankly of principals. If we then turn around and say, okay, principals, we're going to judge you on how many proficient teachers you have. We need standards that are uncoupled from a single instrument. We need to see outcomes in student performance as our goal, not these intermediate steps that staff say are not linked to student outcomes. So if we're going to be outcomes focused, we need to be outcomes focused, and that's student outcomes. And if there isn't a strong correlation between the evaluation instrument and student outcomes, then we shouldn't be using that as our driver. And I think Ms. Peugeot wanted to answer.
Yeah, Ms. Peugeot, you're going to respond to Ms. Sawyer.
I'll actually defer. Ms. Sawyer, I'll actually hold my comment for a moment. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Jones, we coming back to you.
Yes, and thankfully, Ms. Sawyer made quite a few observations that I had raised my hand to make. I still come back to the subjectivity part of these ratings and what's the right term? And it's based on location. Because if you put a teacher in an environment that is, quote, easier to teach versus an environment where you're having, I'll just go back to my experience years ago when it was a much less difficult population of students to teach. I had a classroom where students were there and ready and receptive. I got a lot more accomplished. But you get a classroom, and it could be 1 or 2 children that are hard and difficult. You will see a much different, in observing, you'll see a much different manifestation of what is considered objectively good teaching, or subjectively, I should say, good teaching. So I so agree with what has already been stated by my colleague, Ms. Sawyer. And that's why I asked for a whole lot more specificity on where these teachers and other support personnel were housed. And let's just say other support personnel. I'm going to take psychologists out of it because they evaluate whoever needs the evaluation. Let's take social workers and counselors. Social workers at one school, in a high need school, have a much greater burden, if you will, than some schools, which really, quote, don't need a social worker. So I think our tendency to high standards, yes, have high standards, but let's give these people the support that they need and not penalize and use punitive measures. As I had some years ago, a teacher of some teachers that met with me from a high need school, they wanted me to invite some of my board colleagues to come to their school and see for a day what they experienced. So teachers are doing a great deal, and the subjectivity, the fact that Ruby Jones teacher can be in one place in this district and be a star, and then another place, not so. So there's a lot of work we need to do in looking at the instruments and how we evaluate teachers before we penalize teachers and run teachers off who, by the way, are already running to places that, quote, they feel are more supportive of them in the profession that they've chosen.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. I'm going to recognize, give Christine Pajot an opportunity. Do you want to respond to that?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing that we do have control over, and this board has control over, is the number of years that we can demonstrate to teachers that we want to invest and support and grow them, to Dr. Jones's point. So that's why we're suggesting that so long as a teacher meets those standards and is proficient, that's important, and not to ignore. And Mr. Strain, in response to the comments that you made regarding highly effective teachers being better for students than effective teachers, I don't think that anybody's disputing that, but I would like to share an interesting piece of data. This did not come through on the data responses. It wasn't a specific question that was asked, but we really did want to take a look at this comprehensively. And Chris, you can correct me if I'm citing this data incorrectly, but if we looked at all of the teachers in the district for 18-19 who were majority proficient, okay, they were majority proficient, and these are the ones that we are suggesting be renewed on 4-year contracts. 76% of the students tied to them met or exceeded growth. Now, if we look across the district at the teachers who achieved the majority of accomplished or higher, that did jump to 89%. But 76% is not something that I think this district is prepared to lose. 76% of the students tied to effective teachers or proficient teachers met or exceeded growth. 89% of the students with the highly effective teachers met or exceeded growth. So I think these are important statistics to note. And briefly, in response to the questions about the integrity of inter-rater reliability and reasons and bias for that really administrators have to face when they're conducting observations. I believe it was Ms. Marshall who raised this point at the last committee meeting. We certainly don't want to have a situation where principals or administrators wanting to keep these teachers and wanting to demonstrate that support and commitment to them all of a sudden change or alter ratings in order to keep these teachers on board. Because unfortunately, when things are tied to performance in that way, and we don't have systems that we can say with true fidelity really connect and correlate to student achievement, there can be instances where those ratings are inflated for different reasons. And that couldn't even get us that's just going to get us further from where we need to be in terms of really wanting to embrace the instrument that the state has adopted and aligning our PD and our professional development with those standards so that we can support those teachers. But that takes time, that takes planning. To Mr. Strain's excellent point, that takes looking at where we currently are and establishing a baseline from which we can establish goals to achieve. And that does not happen overnight, and that does not happen from a single source. That is a multi-phased approach that needs to be done and should be done, and there is much opportunity, and we are willing to roll up our sleeves and get there. We just don't want to unfairly stand in the way of proficient teachers by telling them that we want you for less than a year, because really that's what that's saying. That's saying we're taking you from 4 years to 1 year. At the risk of student achievement, because again, 76% of their students met or exceeded growth.
Madam Chair, if I could, it is 11:01. We've been here for a little under an hour. I have nothing planned. Well, we used to have 176 schools, but apparently we're down to 166. So I got to go find those 10 schools we lost. But other than that, I've got time. I don't know what the time of the committee is. And so I guess I would encourage y'all, if y'all have technical questions or questions for Peugeot and her team, maybe we can wrap those up and then y'all can get into ultimately what is a discussion and debate about what the four of y'all would like to do moving forward with this policy.
Thank you. I just want to say that I haven't been in the schools, and Ms. Peugeot, I hear everything you're saying. You're exactly right. We want teachers to be effective and highly effective, but I truly know that that work is for the administrator and the school to ensure that that happens. And I think if this is the evaluation instrument we're using, and this is what we're saying, and unfortunately it is tied to the 4-year contract. We're saying it shouldn't be, but is that not what we're looking at to provide a 4-year contract? We're looking at the evaluations. Is that what we're using? So just how do you separate that? And I do believe, as Dr. Jones was talking about different schools, I've been in those schools where, yes, it was difficult. It was hard. And the goal is to ensure that the teachers have the tools, the support, what they need to grow so that they impact student achievement. And right now, it's about the children. It's about ensuring that we have highly effective teachers in classrooms to impact student achievement. And I think expectant accomplished is not an it's not an unacceptable task. We're saying 3 out of 5, but I believe these teachers are looking at being accomplished. We're saying all proficient Yes, but I believe we also should be saying working towards accomplish and looking at accomplish for a 7 or 8 year teacher who is doing that work. Many of them are, and I don't see administrators giving ratings just to get them there. I don't, and I've known a lot of these administrators, and I don't think that's what we're saying. I think what we're saying is we should have high expectations so that these high expectations meet the needs of our students. Ms. Sawyer.
Thank you. We are as a committee need to make a decision, and by my count we are at a 2-2 impasse. I would like to propose a compromise position here that, and I'm not going to put it in policy language because I just want to put it out there first before we make a formal motion, if there is the will to even go that far, to think about whether, I know that there is, I personally don't have that much faith in the instrument, and I listened to staff on that, but you know, if other members of the committee are wedded to having an accomplished standard on the evaluation, I would suggest that we require accomplished in standard 4, which is the instruction, the standard related to instruction, and that be what we use going forward. So it would be proficient, at least proficient in the rest of the standards, and a required accomplished in standard 4. I don't have evidence that this will drive student achievement and student outcomes, so I'm reluctant to make it, but I think this would allow something to go forward to the full board.
Mr. Strain.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The evidence, it's interesting because we've talked about this evidence of the linkage between the evaluations and student performance, and it was presented here in this committee today that there is a linkage, that there is a significant differential. Ms. Pajot, could you repeat those numbers? I think it was 72 and 89 or 76 and 89%, significant differential between those that have met 3 of the 5, including standard 4, and those who have not.
76%
and 89
of the students tied to teachers who are proficient met or exceeded growth. 89% when we talk accomplished or higher, notwithstanding the other areas that we identified that could be problematic in terms of inter-rater reliability.
Understood. So there is a linkage, and that's supported by data. And so I would like to maintain the standard and the expectation that we set 3 years ago, that every one of these teachers signed contracts 3 years ago with that policy in place. We established that the policy, whilst not written into the contract, was linked, and regardless of whether it was linked or not, it was a policy of this board. And so it was understood that that was what the expectation is. Those teachers, our administrators, our zone superintendents, our learning community superintendents, our HR department should all be working toward that objective. What we've done is we've taken a snapshot, and correct me where I'm wrong here, but this snapshot is 2 years into that 4-year process. The snapshot we're looking at is the evaluations 2 years into the 4-year process. Is that correct, Ms. Pajot?
In 2022, they would be up for renewal next year.
But
more than 2 years in.
The evaluations we're looking at are 19-20 evaluations, right? So,
I see what you're saying. They're dated. So much of the data we looked at is actually 18-19.
Yeah, so even better. That would be a year earlier, right? And so from that perspective, this is the growth that we are expecting. And so they're on course. And so if if we want to make a change, the proposal I would make is that we introduce a 2-year contract, that 2-year contract following the 4-year contract would still have an expectation of growth such that they were accomplished in standard 4, but perhaps not accomplished in 3 of the 5, right? I still think that they should be. There's no reason they shouldn't be. And so they're working toward that objective. We've got a 4-year contract as currently spelled out in policy, and a 2-year contract if they are accomplished in standard 4 and proficient in the others. And so that's what I think would be a reasonable way forward. What that would suggest, and that I would put a motion on the table and will do now, that we reject the current proposal by staff in order to change our current policy. And if we want to have staff come back and present some lower standard on evaluations for a 2-year contract renewal, then I would certainly be willing to look at that. We've got a whole lot of policies in the backlog that we need to take through, but I move that we reject the current recommendation to change this policy, and that we direct staff to look at the potential of a 2-year contract for accomplished on standard 4 and proficient in all of the others.
Does everyone understand the motion before you?
No.
Mr. Strain, would you repeat that, please? And then there is no second, so I just want to make sure everybody understands he is making a motion if anyone wants to second it, but I'll ask him to recite it so everybody understands what it is.
I move that we reject the staff proposal to change the policy as written, but that we also direct staff to look into a 2-year contract to be awarded in the event that the teacher, after 7 years now, after this 4-year period, has achieved accomplished in standard 4 and at least proficient in the others, but does not have the 3 of 5 standard required for the 4-year contract.
I can second that motion.
Madam Chair, you have a motion that is probably before you and seconded by Ms. Shipp. The item before you is that motion and that second, and that is for the discussion of the committee at the chair's pleasure.
Discussion. Ms. Sawyer.
Yeah, I'm just need to clarify so that potentially out of this, we'd be asking HR to issue 1-year contracts to staff who are rated proficient across the board in this band, 2-year contracts to those that have an accomplished in standard 4, and 4-year contracts to those who have the majority of accomplished,
including standard 4.
Including standard 4. I have a concern that we are going to create a burden on HR that they will not be able to meet. We have a great Cracker Jack team, but I know that we are under-resourced in staff. That has come through loud and clear this year. I also know that when I talked to one of our Bank of America executives on loan in HR a couple years ago, she laughed when I asked about whether we were adequately staffed or even to meet the needs of our 18,000 employees, and could not imagine the level of staffing we have in a corporate setting. So that as much as I would like to say, oh yeah, well, we can do anything, I think there's a point at which we will overpromise and underdeliver. But I would defer to Ms. Peugeot on that. I know that I still maintain that we are creating a more complex system than it needs to be. And I think if we want to keep, if we have an interest, and I think we do, in retaining qualified staff, we're not going about it in the best way. That concludes my comments. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say, I hear you, Ms. Sawyer, but you start out with a one-year contract anyway. If you talk about the different levels of contract, because when you first come, before you get to 3 years for licensure, you had a one-year contract. So the one-year contract is already there. And we were looking at a 4-year. To me, if this is what's best for our children ultimately, and student outcomes and student achievement, and working with our staff and giving them the possibility to show them, as you say, we want to recognize them, appreciate them, also help them grow and say, here's how we move in those increments towards this 4-year. I think this makes sense. Yes, it's hard work. Yes, it's a lot of work. In the schools, it's hard work. It's a lot of work on the administrators. They will be involved too, but this has been done. Hard work, a lot of work is what it's about when we're talking about our children and ensuring that they get what they need. So yes, it's hard work. And I do understand. I even asked about the budget to support HR department. I don't know if anybody heard that, to put more staff in HR. There was a time we had more staff in the HR department. You're exactly right, Ms. Sawyer. But is that a reason to say we can't do it? Or should we look at how do we support the HR department in terms of staff and in terms of funding? So, and I know that's another whole issue, but I do think it can be done. Yes, Ms. Sawyer, did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say that I can guarantee you in this budget cycle, we are not going to be increasing staff in HR.
Well,
and I would like to ask Ms. Peugeot to respond to my comments.
Ms. Peugeot.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly you will not hear from anyone on this team as a priority argument about being able to manage and support a system. However, now that this has been raised in the space, it's critically important that we have a system that we can also manage that's being used to implement evaluations across thousands upon thousands of staff. That is not something that is stood up in a day. It's not a process that's done by paper, for example. So this would have to be built into a human resources information system. And the more complex we make it with an if then that type of system, it does add complexity that's going to take staff attention to be able to support the process that may take away from the staff who are required to focus on the core of why we are here, where we are, and how we can connect effectiveness and help support our teachers get to where they need to be to fully support our students. We have a staff of 2 that handles performance management. And this staff was recently brought on just at the end of 2020 to be able to look at these systems. So again, just from a logistics standpoint, not only would you need human capital infusion to be able to support a more complex system, but you would need investments in the resources to be able to support teachers and have a more effective, have a better and more complete picture about what makes an effective teacher. So we've talked about things in HR and with the superintendent and with cabinet, things, and even with the board in different aspects of climate and culture at schools, and investing in engagement and investing in student surveys so they can help us better understand what's happening at each school. But all of those, again, not only take human capital across various departments, but they take investments in those resources to be able to do that. That's not something that district leadership draws up as a survey on a piece of paper. We would have to go out, get experts, have consultants come in and help us get to where we need to be. So I appreciate that the issue about managing the system was raised, because we also want to make sure that the output and what we create is something that we can effectively manage within HR. And yes, we are stretched thin. We are doing things to recruit. We are doing things to retain. We are doing things to build out career pathways for both instructional and non-instructional teachers. We are helping support professional development on building a stronger leadership pipeline. So this notion that the staff and human resources don't strategically support student outcomes and don't impact the classroom is nonsense.
Madam Chair, if I could, I'd also remind y'all that there's $11 million that is a contingency from the county that goes out of the HR budget, which would further exacerbate student outcomes and our ability to evaluate teachers. That is being proposed by our friends on the 11th floor.
Correct.
And that's material to this, how?
Well, going to Ms. Peugeot's comments, if we do not have as many staff in HR, it's difficult for us to do the evaluation tool to see the outcome of our teachers to determine a 1, 2, or 4-year contract to improve student outcomes.
Yeah, I got all that. We're really conflating issues here.
No, I don't think so, because it's a mentoring process in managing. Once upon a time, we had effective teacher training that was common across the district. And so we are not. We have a piecemeal system now in which we have no way of common in a common way consistently evaluating teachers. So are we on the course of penalizing for what we have not enabled from our professionals, from our teachers? I think we are. So I see saying 700, and I can't ever keep it in my mind, 761 or whatever the number is. That's astounding to me. And it is a signal that we at the leadership level, for whatever reasons, have not over the years looked at this and supported our teaching force. And so we want to zap them of the work and integrity and that they've put into teaching. I mean, subjectively, it has been stated that teacher X can move from one school where she's or he has been a master teacher and move to another and is a flop. So what are we evaluating? It's the whole process is wrong. And the bottom line, we will lose human capital with great potential. And so we can debate this all day long. Can we move along to seeing where we are?
Yeah, the motion's on the table.
Mr. Strain,
the motion on the table, of course, is to maintain the standard for 4-year contracts and to introduce a standard for 2-year contracts that is between the 1 and 4-year contracts. And so, Madam Chair, I do have an 11:30 a.m. call that I'm required on.
Okay, the motion was put on the table and second. Are we here to vote? We've had discussion. Are we here to vote on this now?
Yes, ma'am. And Ms. Shipp, if there's no more debate by the committee members, you're free to call the vote.
Okay, we're gonna call the vote on this. Those in favor of this motion, please say yes or raise your hand.
Yes.
Yes. Those not in favor?
No.
2-2.
Madam Chair, that is a 2-2 vote. That motion does not pass, and we are back to the original discussion, and there is no current motion on the table. So the committee needs to determine what they want to do at this point.
All right. Okay, Mr. Strain.
I move that we accept the staff's recommendations to incorporate the changes to this policy.
Second.
Any further discussion?
Well, that's for the chair to.
Any further discussion on that?
Yes, I want to be some specificity. My old man, tell me. elaborate what
Staff brought us changes to a policy, and we are voting on whether we should accept the staff's changes to the policy that this board accepted 3-1 at one point. It went to the full board and then was sent back to us. And so the question is, do we send it back to the full board as staff presented it? That's the motion on the table, that we send it back to the full board as staff had written it.
I have no problem.
And Carol,
I seconded that motion,
Yeah.
and I support that.
Yeah, now that I understand what we're talking about, I support it. Mhm.
Okay, do we have a vote?
So we're calling for the vote.
We're
right?
calling for the vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. In favor to send it back to the board?
Yeah.
To the,
So Sean, you're not supporting it, even though you made the motion? I'm confused.
No, I'm not supporting it, even though I made the motion.
Okay.
well,
And all of those opposed.
Madam Chair,
don't
Madam
need to
Chair,
be
if you'll call
opposed.
for the noes.
okay. Those not in favor, just send this straight to the board. Not even.
Madam Chair, that is a 2-2 vote for the motion made by Mr. Strange, seconded by Ms. Sawyer. That motion does not carry. There is no motion before you. Y'all are what you are. Ms. Sawyer has asked for recognition.
Ms. Sawyer,
Well, I think it's pretty clear that this committee is deadlocked on this issue, and it makes sense for it to go to the full board for discussion. So, I mean, if we don't vote it out of the committee, it can't go to the full board. It's clearly something the board is going to have to handle as a committee as a whole. So that's what I thought Mr. Strain was proposing, that it go to the full board for consideration. I mean, the board doesn't have to accept it, they can amend it, but we need to move on this policy. Failure to move on this policy goes against the superintendent's recommendation, and I think that is problematic. We want to be able to hold the superintendent accountable for outcomes for our students, but if we deny him a tool that he thinks is important, it's going to be harder to hold him accountable for student outcomes. So
I can agree with that, Ms. Sawyer.
May I make a motion?
Okay, all right. Mr. Strain, do you have a question in discussion for what Ms. Sawyer just said?
I did. I fundamentally disagree with what Ms. Sawyer just said. This policy committee, its charge is to evaluate changes to policies to put forward for the full board. That's its charge, not to approve staff recommendations, not to approve everything staff asks in order to pass it on. And so this policy committee has spoken. There is no requirement to send this back to the full board. And so as such, we just voted. Deadlock means you don't approve the changes, right? The only way to approve things to go through to the full board is to approve the changes as a majority vote. That takes 3 votes. A 2-2 rejects the changes. And that's what we've just done. If staff wants to go reconsider and bring something back to us, fine. If then the chair wants to reconsider those and bring them back to this policy committee, that's fine. But the policy committee is constituted to evaluate policy changes. And once it's approved by the majority of this committee, then it goes to the full board. We don't just pass stuff through to the full board for consideration.
Also problematic is that we have 4 members. And I've always, since I've began on this board, in other situations in which we have to make decisions, that we have at least a number of people that we don't get deadlocked in this regard. So,
Ms. Sawyer.
This board does have precedent in handling some policies as a committee as a whole. Policies that are deemed important have in the past been handled not by the policy committee, but taken up by the board as a whole. And I would suggest that this one move to the full board for consideration.
Second.
And I can make a motion to that effect.
Miss Sawyer,
Yeah.
we are,
That's not
we're
correct.
gonna get into
That's
some
not.
technical issues here.
No, ma'am.
So if I could just see if you could just state your motion specifically to make sure that it is a permissible motion.
I move that the policy committee refer policy, and I don't know the number, GCOA?
GCO, yes, ma'am.
GCOA to be discussed by the full board as a committee of the whole.
So your motion, if it was seconded, just to make sure I'm clear, would be that you are recommending that the policy committee vote to send the policy to the full board without a recommendation either way.
Right.
Ms. Root, I believe that is a permissible motion since it technically is not making a recommendation, which would have been the prior motion. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I mean, you can't re-vote on a motion that has already been made, and the previous motion was to not adopt the recommendation, correct?
Well, they've had two motions. The first motion was to have a modified. The second motion was basically to adopt the recommendation or approve the recommendation, propose the recommendation. That motion failed. So the prevailing side on that motion was ship and strain. So if the substantive difference between this motion and the prior motion made by Mr. Strain and seconded by Ms. Sawyer is that there is no recommendation coming out of policy. They're just asking it to be moved forward to the full board without a recommendation. The motion that just failed included a recommendation of approval. I think that's probably different enough to be a valid motion, but I yield to you.
I don't remember any of those words, recommendation of approval previously. I just remember the motion being that we send it through to the full board.
Yeah, Mr. Judah, I think you need to have a look at the policy. I don't have it in front of me in terms of what the policy committee does, because I believe Mr. Strain's interpretation is correct. And again, I may be wrong because I do not have the policy in front of me.
So the policy, the purpose of the policy committee, the policy says, is to review policy proposals and make recommendations to the board regarding proposals to revise or adopt new policies in accordance with board policy BG and administrative regulation.
So key here is make recommendations to the full board. Is that correct? Is that key terminology?
And
make
we're not
recommendations.
And we're not sending a recommendation. We're saying that we
well, we are saying that we are split.
Miss Mays, going to your point, per the exhibit BGE, which is tied to policy BG, under item 3B, which defines the role of this committee as I see it, the policy committee can do one of two things. Policy administrator can, policy committee may make a recommendation to the board regarding policies to revise or adopt new policies. Secondarily, the policy committee may defer action on a proposed policy or communicate concerns or recommended modifications to the superintendent for his or her review. Those seem to be the two actions that are permissible per the policy, Madam General Counsel.
And those were the two motions that were just voted on, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. So under that logic, then Ms. Sawyer's motion would not be in order.
Madam Chair, I do need to go to my follow-on meeting.
Mr. Strain. So, okay. So we voted, we made a motion, we voted, and we're split. So
the motion's failed.
And the motion failed. So
Yes, Madam Chair.
Motion to adjourn.
Excuse me, Mr. Jeter.
Miss Root was going to say something. I was going to yield to Miss Root.
Okay, Miss Root.
Yeah, Ms. Shipp, I was just going to say, the second action is the policy committee may defer action. And then it says in the typical circumstances, the policy would then be presented to the policy committee at a later meeting for further review and action after it's sent back to the superintendent. So I think by taking no action, it results in this being sent back to the superintendent with recommendations for him for further consideration.
But that was considered, and that motion failed as well. So, Madam Chair, I've got to go. We're over time. I move that we adjourn.
Because it's going to have.
Point out to Mr. Strain that we have a quorum even if he's not present. So
I'm painfully aware of that, which is why I'm making the motion to adjourn, because we're over time.
Well, we have voted to send it back to the superintendent to look at additional recommendations.
No, ma'am. I believe y'all have not made any affirmative vote. None of your motions have passed. I think what Ms. Root is saying is, under the guidance, this theoretically goes back to the superintendent anyway. The superintendent has a right to bring back forward recommendations under the provision of the policy chair at any time. There's nothing that would preclude the superintendent from bringing new recommendations next month, as long as the policy chair is willing to put that on the agenda. So there is no affirmative action as of right now. There is no affirmative action that staff nor the committee has to take if this meeting were to adjourn at this point. And you do have a motion on the table without a second at this point.
A motion. Okay, Mr. Strain, you want to put your motion back on the table?
I move that we adjourn. We're 5 minutes late.
And
let me just chime in and say, thank you all for working your way through this tough issue. Obviously, there's more work to do. Just a reminder that
Ms. Dashew, Mr. Strain's motion has not received a second.
Right, and what I was going to say is, if you don't feel that your work is done yet, you can continue your work. That's up to you.
All right. A motion has been put on the table to adjourn the meeting.
Madam Chair, that motion is not in order. That motion was not seconded by anybody.
That's what I was.
The motion's in order. It has yet to receive a second.
I was repeating that.
That's correct. Yeah.
Waiting for a second. I will second to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All in favor?
I cannot, let me see. I'm assuming based on what I'm hearing, I can't see. Can we call the roll? I mean, so Mr. Strain and Ms. Shipp,
vote. The motion fails. The meeting continues because nobody else has stuff on their calendar, but I do. So I'll just move on to that and see if I can clear that calendar.
So Madam Chair, the motion to adjourn has failed, and therefore you are back onto the agenda item, of which there is still no present motion. And I turn the committee over to you to decide what discussion, debate, or questions we go forward with from here.
Since we are not in agreement to adjourn, do we have any discussion, any other motion to put on the table from the committee?
Well, I will just say, if I may.
Jones, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. That I am not going to be in favor of penalizing teachers for lack of consistency and persistence in how we evaluate teachers. And prior to that, how we commonly look at effective teacher training across the district. that we 700 to have that many teachers and our social workers, counselors, underperforming is a statement against us as a district in what we have not been able to do. So.
And I would just say I didn't feel like they were underperforming, Dr. Jones. As Ms. Pajot said, we're talking about effective teachers, proficient versus highly effective, and growing those teachers in that direction. Training is in place. I think Ms. Pajot mentioned that training is in place for the teachers to be trained on this evaluation instrument. Administrators are trained to be able to evaluate. Those things are in place. Accountability and monitoring, of course, is definitely needed. Ms. Sawyer.
And it hasn't been there.
I have a question for Ms. Peugeot, and I apologize for the work that's happening outside of my house, the noise. We're kicking around some terms, effective versus highly effective. Can you, and you gave a percent of met and exceeded growth for each of those categories. How are you defining effective and how are you defining highly effective teachers in this context?
I believe effective is being used interchangeably with proficient, meaning that teachers have satisfied the requirements for their licensure and the standards that DPI has established in order to maintain their teaching certificate. So they're proficient. In common layperson's terms, it can mean that they're doing their job. They're doing a good job. They're not.
So when you gave the percent of met and exceeded growth at 77 something?
76%.
76%. And you said highly effective teachers had 80 something?
89%.
89%. What makes a teacher in your definition highly effective? How many accomplished or whatever ratings how did you define them?
So in that example, we looked at all of the teachers who were rated with an overall rating of proficient on their evaluations, and then looked at the students that were attached to them to determine whether they met or exceeded growth, and came out with those percentages. And then we did the same thing for teachers who were overall rated as accomplished, which I believe is being used interchangeably for highly effective in this discussion.
Highly effective are 3 out of 5.
3 out of 5 at accomplished or higher.
Okay.
So let me understand the growth model, and let me give a little scenario. If I'm a third grader and I am technically I'm in the third grade classroom, I'm performing at a first grade level, and that teacher moves me 1 year to the second grade, am I a highly effective teacher?
Yeah, so there are other components that go into a teacher's evaluation that have to do with observations in the classroom, and that's where we have the inter-rater reliability challenges. So depending on how that rater believes the teacher is either demonstrating or not demonstrating various standards on the instrument, then that rater gives that teacher a score or a rating based on what they've observed in that moment of time. Now, a teacher has the ability to introduce artifacts to support the evaluation, and I'm sure Ms. Munn could go into much more detail in this area, but it's still based on that particular snapshot in time when that evaluator is rating that teacher.
So do we in practice utilize these artifacts and extensively investigate just what I asked for, that teacher has moved the needle? And I say this because I worked across the state of North Carolina in this regard. And so, you know, a person can say they were a principal in what they did, and I'm just going to give an observation that is more holistic. And that's a lot of why I'm holding fast on what I'm saying in regard to protecting teachers. The rights do harbor a negative connotation, because the bottom line is we are all about improving student outcomes, but it gets muddled. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and with the chair's permission, before I yield to Ms. Munn, I do want to say that when we talk about growth, that doesn't impact all of the 761 teachers, because not all those teachers would be subject to EVAS. So these are in courses that have an end of grade or end of course exam. So even if this committee wanted to consider a factor like EVAS or growth, it wouldn't necessarily be applicable to all these teachers. So for example, CTE teachers or specials area teachers, that would not even be something that you could consider for those teachers. The other thing that's problematic when we do look at growth is we have a large teaching force. We have a significant amount of movement across the district every year as well through our transfer process. So sometimes it takes more than 1 year to grow a student, but that student necessarily isn't tied to the same teaching staff over the course of the years of that growth. So this is another layer of complexity that's added to the instrument that makes it very difficult to really get our hands around it and strategically come up with initiatives that are going to address that. I'm not saying that means we throw our hands up and we don't do that very thing, but it's just a way to demonstrate why it's very much multifaceted. Ms. Munn, did you have anything else that was directly in response to Dr. Jones' questions about artifacts that you could share?
Yes, the teacher can bring artifacts to the post-conference to support increase of the ratings. But in regards to being able to see the growth in the classroom, when the observer goes in, they can look for that interaction that supports the growth or the outcomes of the student. They can look at the activities. They can look at the objectives and what the teacher is teaching that day. And if for some reason the observer does not witness all of the lesson, then the teacher can bring the artifacts to the post-conference to support a possible increase in ratings. And when I say possible, it means that the just because they bring the artifacts, that the observer or the evaluator does not have to increase those ratings based on those artifacts, that they can bring evidence of what was missed in the observation.
They can, but is it encouraged and does it actually happen? In many instances, I have over the years that I've been on the board know that it is not.
It isn't. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please address what I just said.
Go ahead, Miss. Go ahead. I was just address. Go ahead, Miss Munn.
I'm sorry. Yes, it is. It is strongly encouraged that they bring artifacts. And most of the time, they receive those artifacts in the classroom. They'll get the lesson plan and they'll get activities that they were teaching during the time of the lesson. But it is strongly encouraged, and they can also write a rebuttal to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm aware of it.
Thank you, Ms. Munn. I was just going to say that's exactly right. I experienced that. And, you know, we used to have an older evaluation, TPAI, maybe what you were talking about, Dr. Jones, but since this new evaluation came out, there are a lot of things in place that teachers have an option to do, evaluators. They have 3 observations. Each time you can ask them to look at their data. They bring their student data to that observation, post-observation meeting after you've evaluated them to say anything you missed in the classroom during that observation, and also to show data. It doesn't have to be EVAS data. You're looking at quarterly data, each quarter, how they're moving their students. There's all kinds of data. In K2, there's not EVAS. So you're looking at their DIBELS data, their MAPS data, their DRA data, their reading data, their math data. And they can bring that and show how they're moving that child in terms of growth. And that's what you're considering when you all are talking about effectiveness of student outcomes. So it is there. The question is every administrator doing this, as you say, with fidelity, and are they making sure that they're following what's expected? That's the, I think, here the question.
That's the question.
But it is there, and it should be done. Yes, Ms. Sawyer.
To the point that we're holding teachers accountable for something that we are not adequately holding principals accounted for. And I think that's why I want to uncouple this process, because I would rather have an evaluation that isn't high stakes and thus sort of becomes a point of manipulation, as opposed to an authentic evaluation where you can make changes and that you can really train. It's more about coaching than evaluation. And if we can shift to a coaching model than an evaluation model, I think our teachers will show more growth and we'll have better outcomes. But as long as we have it coupled to a punitive system, then we're in a whole different world. And that's where I come down. I think it should be built on a coaching model. I mean, I remember hearing years ago when we had mentors.
We still do.
One of the challenges was, were these mentors also your evaluator? Because if they are, then you can't be vulnerable and ask the hard questions about what really you need to do to improve if that person is going to say, do a gotcha moment. And I think uncoupling coaching from evaluation is really important. I mean, we want the coaching to grow our teachers. So that's why I still think that we should accept the superintendent's recommendation.
And we talked about evocative coaching. I'll just add that it's a job of the administrators to use coaching model. We've talked about mentors. Do not do the peer observation. You match that peer observation with someone who can go in objectively to see what the teacher is doing. So the mentor is not the peer observer, shouldn't be. So there are things in place. And the question is, I know you're saying, Ms. Sawyer, is this working? Therefore, is this why we don't have more teachers where they need to be? So who should be accountable for it? And no, we don't want to penalize. I don't think it should be punitive at all. But the question is, should we hold accountability for high expectations for student achievement?
Absolutely. I mean, sorry, but absolutely. I mean, I think student outcomes is what we're looking at, but I'm not sure that this is the way to get there. And I think the
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, Ms. Sawyer.
that, this is not the tool he wants to use to get student outcomes. That's why this proposal is before us.
Madam Chair, Ms. Peugeot has her hand up. And
I didn't see it. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. And I will say that it appears that we are at a standstill. I would remind the committee that if it doesn't move out of committee, that does not preclude the superintendent from taking guidance, feedback from this meeting, which I'm sure Ms. Peugeot and her staff will provide him with, and coming back to the chair of the committee at a future time. Obviously, it's up to the committee what y'all want to do, but I just want to remind you of where we're at. And Ms. Peugeot had her hand raised.
Yes, Ms. Peugeot.
Thank you. Just a response with respect to mentors. Mentors are certainly an excellent tool and process that we can use to facilitate, to see growth and to support growth. However, mentors are available only to beginning teachers.
That's
so
true.
Teachers 1 through 3. So there are certainly opportunities in that area for us to be able to expand that type of support, again, through those teacher leader pathways, additional support in HR and investments to that end. But I did not want the committee to believe that mentoring was something that was available beyond your 3rd year of teaching.
Exactly. Thank you for that. That's exactly right. Thank you, Ms. Peugeot, for that. But they do have peer observations from a peer. And I think that was asked too. Yes, Ms. Sawyer.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay. Anybody?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Madam Chair, that is unanimous vote. This meeting is over. I appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for Mr. Joe and your staff.